Hey there, here we are again. We're going to talk a little bit more about some basic chemistry. Now we're going to concentrate on biological molecules, or the types of molecules that we're going to see over and over again in this class. And basically, when we talk about biological molecules, there are four types or classes of molecule. And each one of these classes has a unique structure, which gives it unique properties. And so we're going to kind of talk about those details a little bit, so hopefully you can understand the differences between them. Now, you've probably heard of a lot of these types of molecules before. So the four types we're going to talk about are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And so certainly in your diet, or when you've read the ingredients on something, you've seen, carbohydrates, and you've seen lipids, you've seen proteins. Nucleic acids you don't really see a lot. When we talk about nutritional value, we don't talk about that too much. So you've heard of these things. You might know a little bit about them, but what we want to do is talk about what makes each one unique, so we can compare and contrast them, and then hopefully you'll get a little bit deeper understanding of not only these things in your diet, but just in biology in general. Lipids, certainly you've heard of fats, and you've probably heard of steroids, and so that's what lipids are, just fats and steroids. It's just another, it's a broad term for those two things. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit of detail. So we're going to start with carbohydrates. Here, hydrated carbons, carbohydrate. And so let's look at a couple of molecules here. Again, I'll throw some of these out there and ask you what they are. What type of molecule is the one on the right? So if you look at the one on the right, it's carbons and hydrogens, and that's it, right? It's a hydrocarbon. We talked about that in a previous lecture. And you remember we talked about hydrocarbons, and they're very long and they have lots of covalent bonds, so they have lots of energy. And what are some common hydrocarbons? Oil, gas, and then things that we burn to use their energy because they're high energy molecules. Well, what type of molecule is the molecule on the left? That is carbons with not just carbons and hydrogens, but carbons with water. That's a carbohydrate. See, by looking at the two, you can see the difference here. Excuse me. And so these are just carbons and hydrogens, what I'm showing you right here. And so that's a hydrocarbon. Now, sugars are carbohydrates, like we said. And the small carbohydrates, like we just saw, the monosaccharides, are called simple sugars. And so this is a term that you maybe have heard talking about your diet, right? Simple sugars. They're simple because they're small. And so they're just a small sugar. And their importance to your diet is they break down very easily. And they're small, and so they can get into your bloodstream quicker. And they're small, and they can get broken apart, and you can harvest energy from them easier. And so that's a characteristic of simple sugars. And so here's another very common simple sugar, glucose. And so when we talk about metabolism and diet, and you talk about carbohydrates in your body, glucose is the most important carbohydrate in your body, and it's very important to your metabolism. You'll remember that in a previous lecture we talked about how these long carbon chains can sometimes loop around on themselves and form a ring, and that's very common in these monosaccharides, in these simple sugars. And you can see that you've got the linear form, but the linear form can wrap around on itself and make a ring form. And so pay attention when we look at some of these different carbohydrates. You can see there's lots of carbon rings that make up these molecules. And just part of learning about these molecules is you sort of learn the conventions for naming them. And so you got glucose and galactose and fructose. They all end in ose, right? And so if you see a name that ends in ose, it's probably a sugar. It's probably a carbohydrate. Now, to build upon a theme that I've already stressed quite a bit in here, compare glucose to galactose, and just kind of go carbon by carbon and look at the molecule and how similar they are. And really the only difference between those two is in that middle carbon. You see on one, the OH, which is called the hydroxyl group. In glucose, in this picture, it's on the right of the carbon. And in galactose, that OH, or that hydroxyl group, is on the left. Otherwise, they're identical, right? It's a very, very small difference between these two molecules, just where that OH is on one carbon. But it's all the difference in the world. It makes it a different molecule, and it gives it different properties. And again, small differences at the molecular level have big differences at the organismal level. And I'm just going to keep showing you examples of that. So here is what's known as a disaccharide. So two monosaccharides together, two sugars, di, Greek for two, called sucrose. And so again, you can see you got the two rings here, and you can see that, again, remember when we draw the rings like this, whenever you've got a vertex, whenever you've got a point, that's actually a carbon molecule. We don't need to write carbon every time. We know that there's lots of carbon, right? It's organic chemistry. And so each one of those points is a carbon. And so and then we also don't write every single hydrogen that's here. Because again, if there's an open spot, and if carbon wants another electron, it just grabs a hydrogen, because those hydrogens are everywhere. And so you don't see every hydrogen, but you do see every hydroxyl, every OH. And so if you look at all those points, most of those points, you see on this picture, it's got an OH attached to it, and you can assume that on the other end, that there's also another H attached to it. We just didn't want to write every one of those. And so on all these carbons, most of those carbons, you've got an H and an OH. You've got a water and a carbon. So again, you can tell this is a carbohydrate. So you got two of those rings, and this is sucrose. And so maybe you've heard of sucrose. There's that ose again, by the way. What's a more common name for sucrose? Well, sucrose is table sugar. It's regular old sugar, all right? And so if you look at the picture here on the left, that's that sucrose molecule. So that's what sugar looks like, the sugar that you're familiar with, simple, regular table sugar. Now the molecule that is on the right here, in the lower right corner, is a molecule called sucralose, which is very similar to sucrose. So just kind of, again, compare these two pictures. Compare these two molecules. You see you've got like a hexagonal ring in both of them, and then you've got a pentagon ring in both of them. And you see you've got lots of OHs attached to all these carbons. So they're very similar. The only difference in the sucralose is you notice you got a few chlorine molecules, right? Look on that sucralose, there's 3 places where you've got a chlorine molecule instead of a hydroxyl. But otherwise the shape is very similar. Well, sucralose, the trade name of it is Splenda, right? And so you're probably familiar with Splenda. That's an artificial sweetener. But why do we have these artificial sweeteners? They give sweetness to something, but you don't get any calories. There's no energy from them. And so by looking at the molecular structure, you can understand that now, because the Splenda gives you sweetness. So whenever you put it in your coffee and drink your coffee's got a little bit of sweetness to it, right? Well, why does that happen? Look at the shape of the molecule. The Splenda is shaped very, very, very similar to the sucrose. And so when it binds to the taste buds on your tongue, it binds to the same places that sugar would bind to. And when it binds to that taste bud, that causes a nerve to fire, and you sense that as sweet. And so because it's the same shape, it can bind to the same spots on your tongue, and so that makes you taste sweetness. But it's different enough that when it gets down into your stomach and your intestine, you can't break it apart. Regular table sugar gets down into your stomach and your intestine, and you can rip it apart and harvest the energy and use that energy in your body. But the Splenda can't be ripped apart, and so it just goes right out the other end. And so you get the sweetness, but you don't get the energy, you don't get the calories. And so that's what artificial sweeteners do. But the point here is by studying things at the molecular level, you start to understand why they do what they do. And sucralose has a very similar molecular structure to sucrose, but it's also a little bit different. So, hey, there you go. Okay, now when we talk about carbohydrates, we've been talking about sugars, but we can also talk about starches. And that's something that, a term you're probably familiar with. You've got starch in your diet. You eat starchy foods. Starches are also carbohydrates. But whereas sugars usually are small and simple, starches are long and complex. And you've probably heard of complex carbohydrates in your diet, right? Well, that's what we're talking about. A complex carbohydrate is the opposite of a simple sugar. It's lots of simple sugars stuck together. That's how you make a complex carbohydrate, which are often called starches. And so when you think about starchy foods, pasta, potatoes, bread, those are carbohydrates, but they're long carbohydrates with lots of simple sugars. And so we're comparing the two in this figure here. So on the top you have a small piece of a starch. You see you've got lots of, each one of those rings is a simple sugar. And you got lots of them stuck together. And this is one part. This is in real life, this is hundreds of those rings stuck together. It's a very long, big molecule. Whereas at the bottom, you've got just one of those rings. That's a simple sugar. So which one of those is going to have more energy? Which one has more covalent bonds? Well, the longer, bigger molecule must have more bonds, and it's got a lot more energy. And so that complex carbohydrate has a lot more energy stored in it, but it takes longer to break those down. you've got lots of energy, but you have to chop it apart, chop a piece off and chop a piece off and chop a piece off and chop a piece off. And so they are slower to digest because they're bigger, you have to break them down, whereas the simple sugars don't have as much energy, but because they're small, you can break them down quickly and they can get into your blood quickly. And so that's what I'm saying here. And so, again, if you think about sugars and carbohydrates and your diet and their relationship to your body, like, if you're going to run a marathon tomorrow or hours before you're going to do some physical activity, a lot of times you'll eat a starchy meal because you're going to carbo load. You're going to get those complex carbohydrates in, which are going to have lots of energy, but it's going to take a long time, and they're not all going to hit your bloodstream right away. Whereas, if you need to quickly replenish energy, you drink, Gatorade or something sugary, and those simple sugars, because they're small, they can, they don't need to be broken down anymore. They're already broken down, and they can get into your blood quickly, and then you can get a small dose of energy very quickly. Now, carbohydrates also provide roughage to your diet. And so, again, talking about the things that are in your diet, you often talk about fiber. When we talk about fiber, we're talking about roughage, we're talking about carbohydrates again. But in this instance, whereas before we talked about simple sugars and complex carbohydrates, and they provide energy to you, the carbohydrates that provide roughage do not provide any energy. You cannot digest them. But it's still good to have this fiber in your diet. Well, why do you need fiber in your diet? Well, a big reason is it helps you poop, right? And so those fiber molecules that are carbohydrates, they don't get digested, and so they pass right through your intestine. But as they do that, they help to absorb water, and they help to form the feces, and they're good for making you regular and helping you poop. And they can do this because they're stuck in your intestine. They can't cross your intestine because you can't digest them. You can't break them down. And so do you get energy from fiber? No. You cannot digest fiber. You're not an herbivore. So now you can eat things that have a lot of fiber, and you can eat things like celery or lettuce that's plant material, that's tons and tons of this fiber, but you can't get any energy from it. You can break the cells open, and the stuff that's inside the cells of that lettuce or celery, you can get a little energy from, but the majority of that just passes right through you. But that's a good thing. I mean, that's good for you. Now, when we look at fiber, what we're talking about is a carbohydrate called cellulose, for the most part. And you've probably heard of cellulose before. Cellulose is a very tough carbohydrate, and it makes the cell wall of plant cells. And so, that's where we get a lot of our fiber from eating plant material. And so what we're looking at here, we're comparing a starch molecule to a cellulose molecule, okay? And you see some superficial, so the starch is on top and the cellulose is on bottom. And you see some superficial resemblance here, right? They're both made of simple sugars. They're both made of these carbon rings. But of course, without looking at the structure here, what's the difference between starch and cellulose to you, right? You can digest starch and you can get energy from starch, but you can't digest cellulose. And so they have a very different effect inside your body. Well, now let's look at the structure of them. They're very similar, but look, there's a very subtle difference. And so in these pictures here, they've highlighted that hydroxyl group again. Remember, hydroxyl is OH. And so look at the OHs on each of these rings. And so if you look at the top starch molecule, you see all those OHs are in the same place. Now, and then in the bottom molecule, in the cellulose molecule, you see the OHs alternate, one on the bottom, one on the top, one on the bottom, one on the top. Now in real life, what they're trying to draw here is these rings have a three-dimensional structure. And so when you form that 6-carbon ring, you know, it's in a plane like this. And then you've got molecules sticking up on top and molecules sticking on the bottom. And so in that starch, those hydroxyls are all on one side of the plane. They're like all underneath. But in the cellulose, it's underneath on one, then it's on top on the other. Then it's underneath on one, then it's on top of the other. You see what I'm saying? Again, the point here is what? What if I keep saying? That's a very small difference. Just where that OH is, but it makes all the difference in the world. It's a difference between you being able to digest starch, but you can't digest cellulose. So anyway, I think I made my point. And so this is what I'm saying there. Again, it's a tiny difference at the molecular level that has a big difference inside the living things. Okay, well, you can't digest cellulose, but who can? We said herbivores, you know, eat plants, and so they get their energy from plants, right? But actually, so you got, you know, who can digest cellulose here, right? You've got several organisms. We can choose one. The correct answer, though, is A, right? So you say, well, cow's an herbivore. Cows eat plants. Surely they get energy from the cellulose. Yes, they get energy from the cellulose, but they don't digest the cellulose. It's the bacteria in their stomach and sometimes other protozoans and things. And so it's the symbiotic organisms in their stomach that can break down cellulose. And then the herbivore can digest the broken down molecules. But the mammals themselves cannot break that cellulose down. And so they rely on other organisms. In this example, the bacteria are the ones that break down the cellulose. And so here's just another figure from your book, kind of underscoring what I've just told you. You see those rings there, and you notice that on most of those carbons, you've got a water attached to them. And again, this is showing, you know, like sucrose, which is something you can digest, and cellulose, which is something you cannot digest. And you got the disaccharide, which has got made of two monosaccharides, and then the cellulose is a polysaccharide. It's many. And again, here they're showing like 3, or I showed you 4, but in real life it's like 100. It's very long chains. Okay, so that was a introduction into carbohydrates. Now let's talk about a different class. Let's talk about lipids a little bit. And so here's a typical fat molecule. And remember, lipids are fats and steroids. And so again, fats, you know, you've got fats in your diet. You're familiar with the concept of fat. Well, this is what a fat molecule looks like. And we won't get into too many details here, but here, I'll point out the things that I want you to notice. Notice on the left here, in the kind of shaded tan or gray, you've got a 3-carbon molecule. That's called a glycerol. So you see you've got 3 carbons connected to each other on the far left. And on each of those 3 carbons, then you have a long tail coming off that's kind of highlighted in sort of an orange color, right? And that orange color, those tails, are called fatty acids. And so you've got this glycerol, and it's got these 3 fatty acids, and so you got 3 it's a triglyceride. And so maybe you've heard of triglycerides, or you've got a blood test and they check triglycerides. Well, when they check triglycerides, that's what they're checking for. And so again, to kind of recognize this molecule, it's very unique. And then it's got those 3 tails coming off of it, right? And those tails are very long. And you'll notice that those fatty acid tails are mostly hydrocarbon, right? They're just carbons and hydrogens. Well, what do we say? What's a characteristic of hydrocarbons? They contain lots of energy, right? And so here you've got a molecule that's made up mostly of hydrocarbons, and so this too is going to be a molecule that stores a lot of energy. And that's what we know about fats, right? Fats store a lot of energy in a small place. And so this is how they do it. They do it by being built from hydrocarbons. And so fats are how animals, my cup got stuck there, are how animals store energy. Plants store most of their energy as carbohydrates, right? Carbohydrates store a lot of energy, but they're big and bulky. And so you think about where do you get starches whenever you eat parts of a plant, like the potato, right? Like the root, or maybe the fruit, or big, bulky places where plants store their energy. Whereas animals, we store our energy in fats, which gives you a lot of energy in a small area. Well, think about the difference between plants and animals, right? Plants don't move. And so it doesn't matter, they don't need to concentrate their energy in a small area. They can have these big bulky roots and things to store energy. And so that's kind of why plants store their energy as carbohydrates. Animals were more mobile. And so we need to store the same amount of energy in a smaller package. And so that's why we store our energy as fats. Fats hold a ton of energy. Okay, so again, you're familiar with fats in your diet. Which fats are the most unhealthy for humans, based upon what you know about dietary intake? Well, it's probably the trans fats. Trans fats have been linked with cardiovascular disease, and they're pretty unhealthy for you. The omega-3 fatty acids, those are good for you. And so, you want to increase the omega-3 fatty acids. And where do you get those from? Where do you get omega-3s from? Well, you get those from fish, so you should eat more fish, nuts, things like that. Unsaturated fats are fats that usually come from plants, like olive oil and things like that. And you've probably heard of caloric fats. That's a made-up thing. That's nothing. You've probably heard of saturated fats. Saturated fats tend to come from animals more. But those trans fats seem to be pretty unhealthy. And so what is a trans fat? Basically, it's just got a slightly different double bond in one of the fatty acids. So you remember, these fats, they have those 3 fatty acid tails. And so they're showing you 2 different fatty acid tails in this diagram here. Sometimes you have a double bond somewhere in that tail, and it causes the tail to kink. And that's actually what an unsaturated fatty acid is. An unsaturated fat has these double bonds, and their tails kind of kink up. And so that's what they're showing you here. You notice that in both of these fatty acids in this diagram, you've got that double bond, and the tail's kind of kinked. But if you look at the hydrogens that they've highlighted in yellow on this picture. On one, the hydrogens are on the same side of the double bond, and that's a cis trans fat. On the other, a cis fatty acid. A cis fatty acid. On the top one, the hydrogens are on opposite sides of the double bond, and that's a trans fat. And so, again, the trans fats are very unhealthy for you, and all they are, their only difference is just where that hydrogen is. That is a really small difference, but it makes a big difference when you're talking about like cardiovascular health. So again, understanding things at the molecular level helps you to see what they'll do at the organismal level. Now, remember earlier I showed you some steroids, and steroids are also a type of lipid. And so here I'm contrasting a steroid with a triglyceride, or with a fat. And so in the lower right is that fat that we just talked about. And you see you've got the 3 tails. That's how you recognize a fat. But in a steroid, those tails shorten up and form rings. And so the way you identify a steroid is it's made up of several rings. And you notice that these rings are a little different than the rings we saw in the carbohydrate. In the carbohydrate, you had lots of waters hanging off of every carbon. You don't see that here, do you? And so, and the rings were bound together differently, whereas the rings are bound more tightly here. And so that's kind of how you would recognize a steroid. And again, you probably heard of steroids. When you think of steroids, sometimes you think of bodybuilders and you know, but there's lots of steroids. Steroid is a class of molecule. And some steroids act as hormones, and so then if you take them, you know, they can influence the growth of your muscle or whatever. But things like cholesterol is a steroid. There's lots of different types of steroids. Steroid is a class of molecule, which is a type of lipid. And then the third type of lipid that we're going to mention here, that I haven't mentioned so far, is a phospholipid. And so for a phospholipid, it's just like a fat, but instead of having 3 tails, it only has 2. And you take one of those tails and you replace it with a phosphate. And that's how you make a phospholipid, phosphate with a lipid. And these are going to be real important in upcoming lectures. And so if we zoom in, you know, what's a phosphate? A phosphate is a phosphorus with 4 oxygens. And so this is a very common, very reactive molecule that we'll talk a lot about. You'll see phosphates keep turning up over and over, and that's all a phosphate is, right? But you take one of those tails in a fat molecule, pull off that hydrocarbon tail, replace it with a phosphate, that's a phospholipid. And they're important because they make up cell membranes. So when we talk about the cell, what defines the outside of the cell? It's a double layer of these phospholipids. And if you look at the phospholipid, an important characteristic of them is that the end with the phosphate is hydrophilic. It loves water. The end with the 2 hydrocarbon tails is hydrophobic. It hates water. And you can reason this out in your brain if you think about it and think about the properties of these molecules. Remember that those tails are made of hydrocarbon, right? Remember what we said about hydrocarbons. They are, you know, when we introduced hydrocarbons, we said things like oil and gas, right? Oil and gas don't play well with water. They don't mix well with water. So the end of the phospholipid that has the hydrocarbon tails is not going to play well with water. But the phosphate does play very well with water. So the end that has the phosphate is hydrophilic. And then you can extend this to just fats in general, right? A regular fat has 3 hydrocarbons, all of which don't play well with water. And what happens when you try to mix fat and water? They don't mix, right? And that's why they don't mix, because the fats are made of these hydrocarbons which don't interact well with water. And so the whole fat is hydrophobic. Whereas in the phospholipid, what I'm showing you here, one part of it is hydrophobic and one part is hydrophilic. And so here's, again, figure from your book, just kind of showing you the different types of fats. And you see that their steroid example is cholesterol, which again is an important component of your diet, and high cholesterol levels have been linked with cardiovascular disease. But and cholesterol is a steroid; it's a type of lipid. But you know, you have to have cholesterol. Cholesterol is important. It's also important to cell membranes, just like phospholipids are. And so, you know, that's why when you really kind of have to avoid when people start saying things like, you know, this food is bad for you, that food is bad for you. That's not a good term, right? You know, you could say things are healthy or unhealthy at certain levels, but there's lots of things in your diet. You know, you need cholesterol in your diet. Your body needs cholesterol. It's just you don't need as much cholesterol as Americans typically get, as I have. My cholesterol levels are bad. But, you know, so high cholesterol levels are unhealthy, but you can't, you know, you want to avoid saying this is good for you or this is bad for you. That's not a that's not an acceptable term.